In 1956, Life magazine sent a reporter to interview the most decorated explorer in American history. Admiral Richard Byrd had walked on both poles. He had flown over Antarctica more than any human alive. He had stood in front of Congress and told them what he saw down there, and what he said was so strange, so impossible to fit into the world we thought we lived in, that the issue was pulled from newsstands within 72 hours. Most copies were destroyed. The few that survived ended up in private collections, never to be reprinted again. This is the story of what Admiral Byrd really saw at the bottom of the world, and the civilization that history is still trying to keep buried. If you want more stories like this one, the ones the textbooks left out and the libraries quietly removed, hit subscribe right now. We publish a new investigation every single week, and you do not want to miss what we are working on next. To understand why a Life magazine interview would be considered dangerous, you first have to understand who Richard Byrd was. By 1956, he was not some fringe figure or amateur adventurer. He was a rear admiral in the United States Navy. He had been awarded the Medal of Honor. He had a ticker-tape parade thrown for him in New York City. Presidents shook his hand. Schoolchildren read about him in their history books. Byrd was the kind of American hero that the government built monuments to. And that is what makes everything that comes next so strange. Byrd's first major expedition to Antarctica happened in 1929. He flew over the South Pole in an open cockpit aircraft, a feat that should have killed him 3 times over. He came back a national legend, but the man who returned was not exactly the same man who left. People who knew him said he had become quieter, more careful. He started writing in private journals that he refused to let anyone read, and he would not stop going back to Antarctica. He returned in 1933. He returned again in 1939. And then in 1946, the United States launched the largest military operation in Antarctic history. It was called Operation Highjump. Officially, it was a scientific expedition. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, over 4,700 personnel, Marines, Navy Seabees, photographers, scientists, and enough firepower to invade a small country. All of it under the command of Richard Byrd. For a peaceful research mission, that is an absurd amount of firepower. The expedition was supposed to last 6 to 8 months. It ended in just under 8 weeks. Ships came home damaged, aircraft were lost. Several men died under circumstances that were never publicly explained. The official Navy report on the mission has never been released in full. The portions that were declassified are heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out. Researchers who have filed Freedom of Information requests over the years have been told that the documents remain classified for reasons of national security almost 80 years after the fact. And when Byrd returned to the United States, he gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio. What he said in that interview is the reason researchers have been asking questions for almost 80 years. He told the reporter that the United States needed to prepare for a war with an enemy that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He said this enemy possessed technology far beyond anything the Allies had used in World War II. And he said the next war would not be a war you could win with bombs and battleships. It would be a war against something the public had not yet been told existed. That interview was carried in a small Chilean paper in 1947. American media barely touched it, but the words were on record. Then came 1956. By this point, Byrd was 67 years old. His health was failing. He had been involved in another classified Antarctic operation called Operation Deep Freeze, which we still do not have full records of. And according to people close to him, he had begun to feel that the public deserved to know something, that hiding it was eating him alive. Life magazine in 1956 was not a fringe publication. It was, at the time, the most widely circulated magazine in the United States. Millions of households received it every week. It was where Americans got their photographs of the world. If Life magazine printed something, it was considered fact, which is exactly what made it the perfect place for Byrd to tell his story. and exactly why, according to the people who claim to have seen the issue, it was never allowed to reach those millions of households. The interview, according to those who have studied the remaining fragments, ran for several pages. Byrd reportedly spoke about a land beyond the South Pole that did not appear on any official map. He described it as warm. He described seeing green plants and animals in a region that should have been frozen solid. He talked about meeting people there. He said the people who lived in this hidden land had warned him that humanity was heading toward a catastrophe of its own making, and that the surface world had forgotten its own history. That last line is the one that connects everything, because if you have spent any time in the world of Tartaria research, you already know what Byrd was describing. You already know what civilization he was talking about. For those who are new to this, Tartaria is the name researchers use to describe a vast, advanced empire that appears on hundreds of pre-1900 maps and then mysteriously disappears from the historical record. You can find it labelled on official Russian maps. You can find it on Dutch maps. The British knew about it. The French traded with it. Encyclopaedia Britannica, in its first edition published in 1771, dedicated a substantial entry to Great Tartary, describing it as the largest empire on the face of the earth. By the time the third edition was printed, the entry had been shortened. By the fifth edition, it was gone entirely. And yet, by the early 20th century, every reference to Tartaria had been quietly scrubbed from textbooks. The empire that once stretched across most of the northern hemisphere was no longer in the official story. Researchers in the Tartaria field have spent decades trying to figure out what happened. The leading theory, and one that fits with what Byrd reportedly described, is that the civilization did not vanish. It retreated, it moved to places the rest of the world could not easily reach, to the high Himalayas, to deep underground networks, to regions of Siberia that remain almost completely uninhabited to this day, and to the unmapped interior of Antarctica, which until very recently was a region almost no human being had ever set foot on. This is the context that Byrd's 1956 interview drops directly into. According to the surviving accounts, Byrd told the Life magazine reporter that the people he met beyond the pole possessed knowledge of energy systems that the surface world had lost. He described what we would today call free energy technology. He described buildings that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being built on top of it. He described written records that predated anything in our current academic understanding of human history. And he described a deep sadness in the people who lived there, the sadness of survivors watching the rest of the world drift further from a truth they once shared. If even half of that interview survived intact, you can understand why the issue had to disappear. Within 72 hours of the magazine going to print, copies were being recalled from newsstands across the country. Subscribers reported that their copies were missing pages. Some received a different issue entirely with the same date stamp. Reporters who asked questions at the Life magazine offices in New York were told there had been a printing error, and the issue had been withdrawn for technical reasons. No further explanation was ever offered. The official record is that the 1956 Byrd interview never happened. There is no entry in the Life magazine archive. There is no published copy in any university library that we have been able to locate. The Library of Congress has nothing. The Byrd Polar Research Center at Ohio State University, which holds most of his official papers, has no record of this interview being conducted. But here is what is strange. In private collections, fragments do exist. Researchers have photographed pages. Auction houses have sold partial copies. A document collector in Buenos Aires reportedly owned 3 full pages of the interview before he passed away in the late 1990s, after which the pages disappeared from his estate. His widow, when contacted by a researcher in 2004, said only that the materials had been collected by men who identified themselves as representatives of a historical preservation society. She could not remember the name of the society and could not produce any paperwork. A second collector in Switzerland claimed to have a complete copy in his vault. He died in 2003. The vault was emptied before his children could inventory the contents. A third partial fragment, photographed by a researcher in Argentina in 2000, shows what appears to be a Life magazine page layout, with Byrd's name in the byline and a photograph of him in his Navy uniform. The page itself is too damaged to read in full, but the magazine logo and the 1956 date stamp are clearly visible. The pattern is consistent enough that even mainstream skeptics have started to admit something happened in 1956. Something was pulled. Something was suppressed. The only argument left is what exactly was on those pages. To understand why this matters for the Tartaria question, you have to look at what happened to Byrd after the interview. He died in March of 1957, less than a year after the alleged interview. The official cause of death was a heart condition. He was 68 years old, which was not unusually young for a man who had spent decades exposed to extreme cold and high altitudes. But the timing has always raised eyebrows among researchers. Before he died, Byrd reportedly told family members that he had said too much. He told a close friend, who later spoke about it on a small radio program in the 1970s, that the powers protecting the secret of Antarctica were not interested in second chances. He spent his final months at home refusing most visitors, working on a private manuscript that his family has never released. That manuscript, according to people who have spoken to surviving Byrd relatives, contains a detailed account of what he saw on multiple Antarctic expeditions. It describes structures, it describes inhabitants, it describes a map of the world that does not match the one we are taught in school, and it describes a warning he was given, a warning he felt he could not carry to his grave alone. The family has never confirmed the manuscript exists. They have also never denied it. Now here is where the Tartaria connection becomes impossible to ignore. The maps that show Tartaria, the ones from the 1700s and earlier, do not show Antarctica the way our modern maps do. They show a much larger landmass, with rivers, forests, and what appear to be cities marked along the coast. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, shows the coastline of Antarctica in detail that should not have been possible without aerial surveying, hundreds of years before the first airplane existed. The Orontius Phineas map, drawn in 1531, shows the continent without its ice cap, with mountain ranges and river systems that modern radar surveys have only recently confirmed are actually there, buried under thousands of feet of ice. Either someone in the 1500s had access to maps drawn by an earlier, more advanced civilization, or the official story of Antarctica being a frozen wasteland that humanity only discovered in the 1820s is missing several thousand years of context. Byrd, more than any other modern explorer, was in a position to know which version of the story was true. He had flown over more of the continent than any human before him. He had access to classified surveying data the public has still not been allowed to see. And he had been told something by someone that he felt he could not take to his grave in silence. Whatever was in that Life magazine interview, it was enough to make the most powerful media company of the era pull millions of copies. It was enough to make a national hero spend his final months in fear. And it was enough to keep the truth of what lies beyond the South Pole locked away for another 70 years. The 1959 Antarctic Treaty, which prohibits military activity, mineral mining, and most independent exploration of the continent, was signed just 2 years after Byrd's death. The treaty is one of the most universally respected international agreements in history. 46 countries have signed it. They all agree that no one is allowed to dig, drill, or build on the continent without coordinated international permission. That is the only place on Earth where every major nation has agreed to leave the ground untouched, which means whatever is down there, the people who know about it have decided the world is not ready to see it. And the man who came closest to telling us, the man with the medals and the parades and the congressional testimony, was silenced first by a magazine pull and then by something else entirely. If the story of Tartaria is real, if there really was a civilization that the maps remembered but the textbooks forgot, then Admiral Byrd may have been the last man with enough credibility and enough courage to point us in the direction of where it went. The interview is gone. The manuscript is hidden. The continent is locked behind treaties. But the questions remain. What did Byrd see beyond the pole? Who did he meet, and why, almost 70 years later, are we still being told not to ask? The next time you see a globe in a classroom, look at the bottom of it. Look at how Antarctica is drawn as a thin white ring around the South Pole on most modern maps. Then go and look at any pre-20th century map of the same continent. Compare them. Notice what is missing. Notice what was once labelled and is now blank. Notice that the size, the shape, and the detail of the continent has been quietly simplified, generation after generation, until what we have today is barely a sketch of what cartographers once drew with confidence 300 years ago. Someone somewhere decided we were better off not knowing. Admiral Byrd disagreed, and whatever it cost him, his story is still here, waiting in fragments for anyone willing to look. If you have made it this far, you already know the truth is not in the textbooks. The next investigation is already in the works, and we are going deeper. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you in the next one.